They said she was walking away with nothing but the clothes on her back. When Harrison Sterling signed the final divorce papers, he didn't just smile, he laughed. He thought he had outsmarted the woman who stood silently by his side for 20 years. He kept the Hamptons estate, the Manhattan penthouse, and the portfolio. Or so he thought. He expected to see her crying in a taxi. Instead, 3 hours later, he watched his prize possession, the $30 million Gulfstream G650, taxiing down the runway, and the only passenger sipping champagne in the window seat. It was his penniless ex-wife. This is the story of how Harrison Sterling lost everything by winning. The conference room at Whitman, Price and Holloway smelled of old leather and aggressive cologne. It was the scent of victory, at least as far as Harrison Sterling was concerned. He sat at the head of the mahogany table, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Brioni suit. He checked his Rolex, a vintage Daytona, impatiently. Is she going to sign, or is she going to stare at the window all day? Harrison muttered to his lawyer, Gavin Roach. Gavin, a shark of a man with slicked-back grey hair and a smile that never reached his eyes, leaned in. Relax, Harrison. She's cornered. The prenuptial agreement from '98 is ironclad, and with the incident in Cabo last year, she knows she has no leverage. She takes the settlement, or she gets nothing. Across the table sat Victoria Sterling. At 45, she was still striking, though today she looked diminished. She wore a simple charcoal blouse and no jewelry. The massive diamond solitaire that had weighed down her left hand for 2 decades was gone, replaced by a pale band of untanned skin. Beside her was Arthur Pendleton, a family attorney who looked more like a tired librarian than a litigator. "Victoria," Harrison said, his voice dripping with faux concern. "We all want to go home. Just sign the papers. The alimony is generous. You'll be able to rent a decent apartment in Queens, maybe even Jersey." Victoria turned her gaze from the Manhattan skyline outside the window to look at her husband. Her eyes were unreadable. "The house in Aspen?" she asked softly. "Mine," Harrison said, tapping the document. It was purchased through the Sterling Trust. "The portfolio with BlackRock?" "Mine. Premarital assets commingled with inheritance." Gavin explained this. "And the jet?" Victoria whispered. Harrison scoffed, exchanging an amused glance with Gavin. "The Gulfstream. Tori, be serious. You can't afford the fuel for the taxi to the hangar, let alone the jet. Yes, the jet is mine. Everything is mine." That was the deal. Arthur, Victoria's lawyer, shuffled some papers. "My client is prepared to sign, provided that the full and final clause is executed immediately. Once the pen lifts from the paper, the divorce is absolute. No grace period, no appeals. You become strangers." "God, yes," Harrison laughed. "I'll sign that in blood if I have to. Give me the pen." The scratching of the fountain pen on the heavy bond paper sounded loud in the silent room. Harrison signed with a flourish. He felt light, unburdened. He was 50 years old, worth $400 million, and as of this moment, a free man. His girlfriend, Jessica, a 24-year-old brand consultant he'd met at Art Basel, was waiting for him at the St. Regis bar. He slid the papers across the table. Victoria didn't hesitate. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply picked up a cheap ballpoint pen from the table, signed her name, Victoria Ann Reynolds, and stood up. "Is that it?" Harrison asked, almost disappointed by the lack of drama. He wanted begging. He wanted her to realize what she was losing. "That's it," Victoria said. Her voice was different now. The tremble was gone. It was colder, clearer. "Goodbye, Harrison." "I'll have the driver take you to wherever you're going," Harrison offered, feeling magnanimous. "No need," she said. picking up her small handbag. "I have a ride." She walked out of the conference room without looking back. Arthur packed his briefcase slowly. "You know," Harrison said to the old lawyer, leaning back in his chair, "I almost feel bad for her. She's never worked a day in her life. What is she going to do?" Arthur snapped his briefcase shut. He looked at Harrison over the rim of his spectacles. "Victoria is a resourceful woman, Mr. Sterling. You often confused her silence for ignorance. That was your first mistake." "And what was my second?" Harrison smirked. "Thinking you were the one managing the money," Arthur said cryptically. He nodded to Gavin and left. Harrison frowned for a second, then shook it off. "Old fool," he muttered. "Gavin, break out the scotch. The 30-year Macallan, we're celebrating." Harrison spent the next hour drinking and texting Jessica. "Done deal. Free man. Pack your bags, babe. We're going to Paris tonight. I want to break in the jet properly." He didn't know it yet, but the ink on the papers he just signed had triggered a cascade of digital encryptions across 3 different continents. While he was pouring scotch, servers in the Cayman Islands and Zurich were shaking hands, moving assets at the speed of light. Victoria hadn't lost. She had just executed the final move of a game Harrison didn't even know they were playing. The air in the back of the limousine was cool, but Harrison was sweating. It wasn't from heat, it was adrenaline. He sat next to Jessica, who was draped in a red Valentino dress that cost more than Victoria's alimony checks for the next 3 months. "I can't believe it's finally over," Jessica cooed, resting her head on his shoulder. "I was so worried she'd try to take the beach house." "She tried," Harrison lied, swirling his champagne. "But my legal team is a fortress. She walked away with a pittance. Honestly, Jess, it's sad. She let herself go, stopped trying. A man needs a partner who matches his ambition." "You're so right, Harry," she smiled, scrolling through Instagram on her phone. "So, Paris? Then maybe down to the Amalfi Coast. I need content for the summer. Whatever you want, the Gulf Stream is fueled and waiting at Teterboro. I told the pilot to have the caviar ready." Harrison's phone buzzed. It was a notification from his bank. Transfer alert. He frowned. He opened the app. A standard notification for the alimony payment, $50,000. It annoyed him, but it was the cost of doing business. He swiped it away. Then another buzz. Asset reallocation notification. Title transfer complete. "That's odd," Harrison muttered. "What is it?" Jessica asked, not looking up. "Just Gavin wrapping up the paperwork, I guess. Probably transferring the deed to the penthouse solely into my name." But the notifications kept coming. Service termination, concierge, account freeze. Warning, Sterling Joint Ventures. Harrison felt a prickle of unease. He dialed Gavin. "Voicemail," he cursed. "Why is my lawyer not answering?" "Harry, relax," Jessica said, playfully taking the phone from his hand. "You're stressed. We're 10 minutes from the airport. Once we're in the air, none of this matters." She was right. The jet was his sanctuary. It was a G650ER, customized with cream leather, gold fixtures, and a master bedroom in the back. He had bought it 3 years ago through a shell company, Apex Horizon LLC, to avoid taxes. It was his pride and joy. The limo pulled onto the tarmac at Teterboro Airport. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. Harrison looked out the window, expecting to see his sleek white jet waiting on the apron, the stairs down, the crew lined up to greet him. The tarmac was empty. "Driver, where are you going?" Harrison barked. "Hangar 4. That's where I keep it." "This is Hangar 4, sir," the driver replied, slowing the car. Harrison rolled down the window. The hangar was open. Inside, it was vacant, just oil stains on the concrete and a confused-looking mechanic sweeping the floor. "Stop the car!" Harrison threw the door open and marched toward the mechanic, his dress shoes slapping against the pavement. Jessica stumbled out behind him, her heels wobbling. "Where is it?" Harrison yelled. "Where is the tail number N788HS?" The mechanic looked up, leaning on his broom. "The Gulf Stream. She taxied out 20 minutes ago. You just missed her." "Taxied out?" "Impossible. I'm the owner. I didn't authorize a flight." "Well, the flight plan was filed," the mechanic shrugged. Pilot did the pre-flight checks, passenger boarded, and off they went. Tower gave them clearance for a transatlantic crossing. Passenger. Harrison felt the blood drain from his face. Who was the passenger? The mechanic squinted at a clipboard hanging on the wall. Manifest lists 1, Pax. Mrs. V. Sterling. Harrison froze. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Victoria!" He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking. He called the pilot, Captain Miller. It rang once, twice. Then it picked up. "Miller, turn this plane around immediately!" Harrison screamed into the receiver. "I don't know what she told you, but I own that plane. This is theft. I'll have your license revoked." There was a crackle of static, and then a calm, familiar voice came over the line. It wasn't Miller. "Hello, Harrison." It was Victoria. The sound of turbine engines hummed smoothly in the background. "Tori, what the hell are you doing?" Harrison roared, his face turning purple. "Get off my plane. Tell Miller to land." "I can't do that, Harrison," Victoria said, her voice sounding clearer and lighter than it had in years. "Miller works for the owner of the aircraft. And as of 4 p.m. today, when you signed that full and final settlement, that owner is Apex Horizon LLC. "I own Apex Horizon." "Actually," Victoria corrected him, "you owned the shares of a holding company that managed Apex. But if you recall the paperwork Gavin had you sign regarding the toxic assets last year, you moved Apex into the blind trust to hide it from the IRS audit." Harrison's stomach dropped. He remembered. It was a clever accounting trick Gavin had suggested. "The blind trust," Victoria continued, "which had a designated beneficiary in case of dissolution of marriage. You never read the bylaws of the trust, did you, Harrison? You just signed where Gavin pointed." You bribed Gavin?" "I didn't have to bribe him," Victoria said. "Gavin has been my brother's college roommate for 30 years. He despised the way you treated me. He just waited for the right moment." Harrison looked around the empty hangar. Jessica was standing by the limo, looking annoyed and checking her reflection in the window, oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding. "Bring the jet back, Tori," Harrison pleaded, his voice cracking. "We can talk about this." "We're done talking," she replied. "Oh, and Harrison, check the glove box of the limo. I left you something." Click. The line went dead. Harrison ran back to the car. He tore open the glove box. Inside was a single envelope. He ripped it open. It was a printout of the deed to the Manhattan penthouse. Stamped across it in red ink were the words, "Lion foreclosure pending." Underneath was a sticky note in Victoria's elegant handwriting. "The penthouse was leveraged against the business loans you took out to buy the crypto startup that failed. The bank is seizing it tomorrow. I paid off the lease on this limo for 1 more hour. After that, you're walking. Enjoy Paris." Harrison looked up at the sky. High above, a tiny silver glint caught the last rays of the sun, heading east toward Europe, toward freedom. He wasn't just divorced. He was homeless. "Babe," Jessica called out, shivering in the wind. "Where's the plane? My feet are hurting." Harrison looked at her, then looked at the empty tarmac. He started to laugh, a manic, broken sound that echoed off the metal walls of the hangar. The ride back to Manhattan was a masterclass in suffocating silence. The driver, a man named Carl who had driven the Sterlings for 6 years, kept his eyes strictly on the road, the partition window raised just enough to muffle the sounds from the back, but not enough to hide the tension. Harrison sat with his head in his hands. The leather seat, usually a throne of comfort, felt slick and cold against his palms. Beside him, Jessica was no longer cooing. The playful, content-hungry influencer had vanished. In her place sat a 24-year-old woman doing mental arithmetic, her eyes darting between Harrison and her phone. "So let me get this straight," Jessica said, her voice sharp, cutting through the hum of the tires on the asphalt. "You don't own the plane. Do you own the apartment?" Harrison looked up, his eyes bloodshot. The adrenaline had crashed, leaving him with a nausea that roiled in his gut. "It's complicated, Jess. Business finance isn't something you'd understand. It's a liquidity issue, a temporary freeze." "Temporary," she repeated, testing the word like it was spoiled milk. "Harrison, you just screamed at a mechanic that you were homeless." "I was emotional. Victoria, she blindsided me. It's a stunt, a legal maneuver. I'll have Gavin fix it by morning." He pulled out his phone again. He dialed Gavin Roche for the 10th time. "This call has been forwarded to an automated voice messaging system." Harrison slammed the phone against his knee. "Damn it!" "My friends are already posting about the trip," Jessica said, her voice rising in pitch. "I tagged the St. Regis. I tagged the Gulf Stream. Do you know how stupid I'm going to look if we're just staying in the city?" Harrison stared at her. For the first time, through the haze of his panic, he really looked at her. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the way her fingers hovered over the delete button on her Instagram post. He realized with a sickening jolt that she wasn't worried about him. She was worried about her brand. "Is that what matters right now?" Harrison snapped. "Your followers. I just lost a $60 million asset, Jessica." "Well, don't yell at me," she shouted back. "I didn't lose it. You did. Mr. Master of the Universe got played by his housewife." The limo slowed as it approached the entrance of the Sterling Tower on 57th Street. This building was Harrison's fortress. He had bought the penthouse 5 years ago, gut-renovating it to include a shark tank in the foyer and a terrace that overlooked the entire park. "Just stop talking," Harrison hissed. "We're here. Let's go upstairs, open a bottle of wine, and I'll fix this." The car stopped. Carl, the driver, got out and opened the door. But he didn't offer a hand to help Harrison out. He just stood there, his face impassive. Harrison climbed out, straightening his jacket. He needed to project power. If he looked weak, the sharks would circle. He marched toward the gold-plated revolving doors, Jessica trailing behind him, dragging her Louis Vuitton carry-on. Normally the doorman, Eddie, would have the door open before Harrison even reached the curb. Eddie had worked there for 10 years. Harrison gave him a $500 Christmas bonus every year, or rather, Victoria did. Today the doors were still. Eddie stood inside the glass, his arms crossed over his chest. Beside him stood 2 men in dark suits who definitely did not work for the building. Harrison pushed against the revolving door. It didn't budge. It was locked. He tapped on the glass. "Eddie, what are you doing? Open the door!" Eddie looked down at the floor, then back at Harrison. He looked genuinely pained. He pointed to the intercom panel on the outside wall. Harrison pressed the button. "Eddie, open this damn door immediately or you're fired!" The speaker crackled. It wasn't Eddie's voice. It was a sterile, bureaucratic monotone. "Mr. Sterling, this is bringing acting on behalf of the insolvency trustee for Sterling Joint Ventures. Access to the penthouse has been restricted pursuant to the foreclosure order filed at 4:05 p.m. today." "Restricted?" Harrison screamed, spit flying onto the brass intercom. "My clothes are in there. My safe is in there. I live there." Personal effects will be catalogued and made available for retrieval in 14 business days. Pending the asset audit. Please step away from the entrance, or we will be forced to contact the NYPD for trespassing. Harrison staggered back, as if he'd been punched. He looked at the two men inside. They weren't security. They were private contractors hired to keep him out of his own life. He felt a hand on his arm. He turned, expecting comfort. Jessica was holding her phone up, but she wasn't recording him. She was ordering an Uber. 14 business days, she said, looking at the screen. Harrison, my passport is in your safe. My jewelry is in your safe. Jess, please. We can go to a hotel. I'll get a suite at the Mandarin. She looked at him, and the mask finally dropped completely. There was no affection, no admiration, just cold, hard disappointment. With what credit card, Harrison? If the bank took the house, they froze the cards. That's how it works. I dated a hedge fund guy in 2008. I know the look. She shook her head. I can't do this. I'm not doing the stand by your man thing for a guy who lied to me about his net worth. It's embarrassing. I didn't lie. I had it all this morning. Well, it's night now, she said. A black Toyota Camry pulled up to the curb, her Uber. Jessica didn't even say goodbye. She threw her bag in the back seat and got in. As the car pulled away, Harrison saw her phone screen light up against her face. She was making a call, probably to the guy she dated before him. Harrison stood alone on the sidewalk of 57th Street. It was beginning to rain. He looked around. Pedestrians rushed past him, indifferent to the man in the $5,000 suit standing in the drizzle. He reached into his pocket for his wallet. He pulled out his terrifyingly exclusive Centurion Black card. He walked to the ATM in the bodega on the corner. He needed cash. Just a few hundred to get a room, buy a charger, figure this out. He inserted the heavy titanium card. He punched in his PIN. Processing. The machine whirred. Transaction declined. Card retained by issuer request. The machine didn't give the card back. Harrison stared at the glowing screen. He had $40 in cash in his wallet. His phone battery was at 12%. And somewhere, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, his wife was drinking his champagne. He sank down onto the curb, heedless of the wet concrete ruining his Brioni trousers, and put his head between his knees to stop the world from spinning. At 41,000 feet, the sky was a deep, bruised indigo, fading into the infinite black of space. The Gulfstream G650 sliced through the atmosphere with a whisper, the turbulence of the lower world left far behind. Inside the cabin, the lighting was set to a warm, amber glow. The air smelled of fresh orchids and expensive leather. Victoria Sterling sat in the club seat by the window. She had changed out of her courtroom armor, the charcoal blouse and slacks, and into a cashmere lounge set she kept on the plane. She held a crystal flute of Krug Clodambonnet, but she hadn't taken a sip yet. She was just watching the bubbles rise, frantic and fast, before disappearing at the surface. Mrs. Sterling. Victoria turned. Standing in the aisle was Sarah, the chief flight attendant. Sarah had been with the jet since Harrison bought it. She was a woman of discretion and grace, who had seen Harrison bring a dozen different women onto this plane, while Victoria was at home raising their son. Yes, Sarah. Captain Miller says we have a strong tailwind. We should be arriving in Zurich 40 minutes ahead of schedule. Would you like dinner served now, or would you prefer to rest? Victoria looked at Sarah. For years there had been a silent understanding between them, a shared look of apology whenever Harrison was drunk and demanding, or when he made Sarah change the flower arrangements 3 times because they didn't look rich enough. Sarah, Victoria said softly, you don't have to call me Mrs. Sterling anymore. I think I'm going to go back to Reynolds. Or maybe just Victoria. Sarah smiled, a genuine warm expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. Old habits, Mum. But noted. She hesitated, then stepped a little closer, lowering her voice, even though they were the only two people in the cabin. If I may say so, when the flight plan update came through, when we saw it was just you, Captain Miller and I, well, we opened a soda in the cockpit to celebrate. Victoria felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't realized how visible her misery had been. Thank you, Sarah. That means more than you know. About dinner. I'm not hungry yet. Actually, Sarah, could you bring me the heavy satchel from the closet? The brown leather one? Of course. When Sarah returned with the bag, she placed it gently on the table and retreated to the galley, closing the partition to give Victoria privacy. Victoria stared at the bag. It was old, battered leather, contrasting sharply with the pristine luxury of the jet. This bag was the deeper level Harrison never knew existed. She unbuckled the straps and opened it. Inside wasn't money. It wasn't jewelry. It was paper. Years and years of paper. She pulled out a file labeled Project Cabo. Harrison thought the Cabo incident last year was just a fight. He thought she was angry because he had missed their anniversary dinner to play golf with a client. He didn't know that while he was on the golf course, Victoria was in the hotel room, hacking into his laptop. She hadn't just been a housewife. Before she met Harrison, Victoria had been a forensic accountant for a boutique firm in Chicago. She gave it up to support his rise, to be the trophy he needed. But she never lost the skill. She never lost the ability to follow the money. She spread the documents out on the bird's eye maple table. Here was the proof of the shell companies: Apex Horizon, Blue Water Holdings, Sterling Ventures. And here was the smoking gun, the illegal transfers. Harrison hadn't just been hiding money from her. He had been hiding it from the SEC. He had been funneling investor capital from his hedge fund into personal real estate projects in Dubai, then covering the losses with new investor money. It was a Ponzi scheme, a slow-moving, high-stakes Ponzi scheme wrapped in a Brioni suit. Harrison thought she had stripped him of his assets out of greed. He didn't understand that she had actually saved him, temporarily. By transferring the assets to herself via the blind trust loopholes, she had removed them from his name before the inevitable federal indictment dropped. If the feds seized the assets, they would be gone forever. In her hands, they were leverage. She picked up a photograph from the bottom of the bag. It was of her and Harrison 20 years ago, eating pizza on the floor of their first apartment. He looked so young then, so hungry, but not yet cruel. "I loved you," she whispered to the empty cabin. "I loved you enough to help you build it, and I loved myself enough to stop you from destroying me with it." She took a sip of the champagne. It tasted like tears and victory. She wasn't going to Zurich to shop. She was going to Zurich to meet with the international banking regulators. She had a deal to make. She would return the investor money, the innocent people's money Harrison had stolen, in exchange for immunity for herself. Harrison was going to lose the penthouse, the jet, and his reputation. But because of what she was about to do in Switzerland, he might avoid prison if he cooperated. It was her final act of mercy. A mercy he didn't deserve, but one she needed to give him to keep her own soul intact. She looked out the window again. The moon had risen, casting a silver light over the clouds. She picked up her phone. She had one message from her son, Leo, who was away at college in London. Dad called. "He sounds crazy. Says you stole the plane. You okay, Mum?" Victoria smiled and typed back. "I'm fine, honey. I didn't steal the plane. I just decided to be the pilot for once. I'll see you in London tomorrow. Dinner is on me." She set the phone down and closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engines lull her into the first peaceful sleep she had known in a decade. New York City has a specific way of devouring the weak, and for the first time in 30 years, Harrison Sterling was on the menu. The rain had escalated from a drizzle to a steady, punishing downpour. Harrison walked aimlessly down Fifth Avenue. His Brioni suit, made of Super 150's wool, was now a sodden, heavy weight clinging to his skin. The water ruined the shoulder pads, causing the silhouette of Power to collapse into a drooping mess. He had walked 10 blocks. Every luxury hotel he passed, the Plaza, the Pierre, the Peninsula, felt like a fortress he was barred from. He knew the managers, he knew the concierges, but he also knew the unwritten rule of their world. Credit is character. Without his black card, he was just a wet man in a ruined suit loitering in the lobby. He stopped under the awning of a closed Tiffany & Co. store, shivering violently. He needed a lifeline. He pulled his phone out, 8% battery. He scrolled past his lawyers, useless, and his employees, likely already fired. He stopped at Preston Calloway. Preston was his golf partner, his drinking buddy, the man who had toasted Harrison at his wedding and then toasted him again when he filed for divorce. Preston was worth $500 million in real estate. Preston would understand. Harrison dialed. "Harrison!" Preston's voice was loud, booming over the sound of a crowded restaurant. "I thought you were wheels up to Paris. Jessica posted a picture of an Uber. Trouble in paradise?" "Preston, listen to me," Harrison said, his voice trembling. "I need a favor, a big one. There's been a banking error. My accounts are frozen. I'm locked out of the penthouse." Silence on the other end. The background noise of clinking silverware seemed to amplify. "Frozen?" Preston asked, his tone shifting. It lost the warmth of friendship and took on the guarded, metallic edge of a businessman assessing a liability. "Frozen by who? The IRS?" "No, it's Victoria. She did something with the trust. Look, I just need a place to crash for the night, or a wire transfer. Just 50 grand to tide me over until Monday. I'm good for it, Press. You know I'm good for it." There was a long pause. Harrison held his breath. "Harry," Preston said, and the use of the nickname sounded patronizing now. "I can't get involved in a domestic dispute. You know how my wife is. She's friends with Victoria. If I take sides..." "Take sides? I'm standing on the street in the rain. I have $40 in my pocket." "I'm sorry, Harrison. Really. Call your lawyer. That's what they're for." Click. Harrison stared at the screen. The betrayal didn't burn. It froze. It was a cold, clarifying realization. They weren't friends. They were a school of sharks swimming in formation. As long as he was a predator, he was safe. The moment he bled, he was food. He slumped against the limestone wall of the jewelry store. He looked at his reflection in the display window, superimposed over a diamond necklace worth $200,000. The man staring back was grey, haggard, and old. A police cruiser slowed down as it passed him. The officer inside eyed him suspiciously. Harrison Sterling, who had donated $10,000 to the policeman's ball last year, instinctively lowered his head, terrified of being told to move along. He walked on. He couldn't stay on Fifth Avenue. It was too painful. He drifted west toward Hell's Kitchen. The streets became grittier, the lighting harsher. He found a 24-hour diner with flickering neon signage, the Metro Diner. He walked in. The smell of grease, stale coffee, and disinfectant hit him. It was the smell of poverty, a scent he hadn't encountered since his father left when he was 12. He sat in a cracked red vinyl booth in the back. A waitress, a woman in her 60s with tired eyes and a name tag that read Marge, threw a laminated menu on the table. "Coffee," Harrison croaked. "Black." She poured it. It was scalding hot and bitter. He wrapped his freezing hands around the ceramic mug, trying to steal its warmth. He looked around. 2 construction workers were eating eggs in silence. A man in the corner was muttering to himself. Harrison reached into his pocket and pulled out his $40. 2 20s. This was it. His net worth. He thought about Victoria. He thought about the jet. He realized with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity that she hadn't just outsmarted him. She had understood him better than he understood himself. She knew that without the money, without the props, he was nothing. He had no hobbies. He had no real friends. He had no relationship with his son. He was a hollow shell painted gold. He took a sip of the bitter coffee and wept, quietly, pathetically, into the steam of the mug. Marge walked by to refill the sugar container. She saw him crying. She didn't look away, and she didn't mock him. She simply slid a plate of toast onto the table. "On the house, hun," she said, her voice raspy. "Looks like you had a hell of a night." It was the first act of genuine kindness he had experienced in 20 years, and he couldn't even afford to tip her properly for it. While Harrison was weeping over burnt toast in Manhattan, the sun was rising over the Alps. Zurich was a city of precision. The trams ran on time. The streets were spotless. The money was quiet. Victoria sat in the back of a black Mercedes S-Class, watching the city wake up. She wore a navy blue power suit, tailored to perfection, and her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon. She looked like a CEO, a diplomat, or an assassin. Today, she felt like all 3. The car pulled up to a nondescript building on the Bahnhofstrasse. There was no sign outside, just a heavy brass plaque with the number 14. This was the headquarters of Banque Cantonale de Valois, one of the most secretive private banks in the world. She exited the car, carrying the battered leather satchel. She was met at the door by a man in a grey suit who introduced himself as Herr Altdorf. He didn't smile. He simply nodded and led her through a series of security checkpoints that made the TSA look like a mall cop patrol. Biometric scans, retinal scans, weight sensors. Finally, she was ushered into a conference room. The walls were panelled in walnut. The view looked out over the pristine waters of Lake Zurich. Sitting at the table were 3 men. In the center was Elias Vogel, the bank's director of compliance. To his left was a man Victoria recognized from the news, Special Agent Miller of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. To his right, a representative from the Swiss Financial Market Supervisory Authority, FINMA. "Mrs. Sterling," Vogel said, gesturing to a chair. "Or should I say, the new trustee of Apex Horizon." "Victoria is fine," she said, sitting down. She placed the leather satchel on the table. She didn't open it yet. "You have created quite a disturbance, Victoria," Agent Miller said, his American accent jarring in the quiet room. "We've been tracking your husband's activities for 18 months. We were preparing to raid his offices next week. Then suddenly, yesterday afternoon, $60 million in assets moved out of his jurisdiction and into accounts controlled by you." He leaned forward. "Technically, that makes you an accomplice to money laundering, or at best, guilty of obstruction of justice." Victoria didn't flinch. She folded her hands on the table. "Agent Miller," she began, her voice steady. "If you raid Harrison's offices next week, you will find nothing but empty servers and shredded paper. Harrison knew you were getting close. He was preparing to move the liquidity to the Cayman Islands and flee to a non-extradition country. That's why he bought the jet." Miller frowned. "We have no intel on that." "I do," Victoria said. She opened the satchel. She pulled out the Project Cabo file and slid it across the table. "This contains his correspondence with a broker in Montenegro, regarding citizenship by investment. It also contains the encryption keys to the offshore accounts you haven't been able to crack." The three men looked at the file. Vogel picked it up, his eyebrows raising as he scanned the pages. "Why are you here, Mrs. Sterling?" Vogel asked softly. "You have the money. You have the jet. You could have disappeared." "I don't want the money," Victoria said. The truth of the statement rang in the room. The money is dirty. It belongs to the pension funds and the families Harrison defrauded. She reached into the bag again and pulled out a hard drive. This drive contains the authorization codes to repatriate every single cent of the stolen capital. $300 million. Agent Miller stared at the drive. It was the holy grail of his investigation. "And what do you want in exchange?" "Immunity," Victoria said. "Full immunity for me. I was a signatory on some of the early joint accounts. I didn't know what he was doing then, but on paper I look complicit. I want a written agreement that I will not be prosecuted." "Done," Miller said immediately. "If that drive is real, you're a witness, not a target." "And," Victoria continued, her voice hardening, "I want a plea deal for Harrison." The room went silent. "Excuse me?" Miller scoffed. "The guy ran a Ponzi scheme. We're looking to put him away for 20 years. If you put him away for 20 years, the investors get pennies on the dollar after years of litigation," Victoria countered. "Harrison has hidden assets that even I can't access without his biometric confirmation. Another 50 million or so. If you offer him a deal, say, 5 years in a minimum security facility in exchange for full cooperation and surrendering the remaining assets, he will take it. He's a coward. He can't handle hard time." "Why do you care?" Vogel asked, studying her. "He treated you like furniture." Victoria looked out the window at the lake. "Because he is the father of my son. I want Leo to know that his father paid for his crimes, but I don't want his father to die in a cage. And—" She paused. "And because the worst punishment for Harrison isn't prison, it's irrelevance. If he's in jail for 20 years, he becomes a martyr, a legend of Wall Street greed. If he gets out in 5, broke and disgraced, working as a consultant or a clerk, that is a living hell for a man like him." She pushed the hard drive toward the center of the table. "Those are my terms. The money goes back to the victims. I walk away free. Harrison gets 5 years and a chance to survive. Take it or leave it." Agent Miller looked at Vogel. Vogel nodded slightly. Miller picked up the hard drive. "I need to make a call to the U.S. attorney. But I think we have a deal." Victoria let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since the day she married Harrison. "Good," she said, standing up. "I have a flight to catch. My son is waiting for me in London." "One question," Vogel asked as she turned to leave. "The jet. It was purchased with stolen funds. It will be seized." "I know," Victoria smiled, a small, genuine smile. "I already filed the flight plan to fly it back to JFK tomorrow. You can have it. I prefer flying commercial anyway. The champagne is better." She walked out of the conference room, leaving the 3 powerful men staring at the door, realizing they had just been outmaneuvered by a woman they had underestimated for her entire life. The rain in Manhattan had turned into a cold grey mist by morning. Harrison Sterling was still sitting in the booth at the Metro diner. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago, a dark, stagnant pool reflecting the fluorescent lights above. He had nowhere to go. The battery on his phone was dead. His suit had dried into a wrinkled, stiff caricature of luxury. He was waiting, though he didn't know what for. Perhaps for the manager to kick him out. Perhaps for the sun to explode. At 7:15 a.m. the door to the diner opened. The bell chimed, a cheerful sound that felt intrusive in the heavy silence. 2 men in dark windbreakers walked in. They didn't look around. They walked straight to the back booth. Harrison looked up. He recognized the lead man, though he had only seen him in photos his security team had shown him. It was Special Agent Miller. Harrison didn't run. He didn't argue. He simply straightened his tie, an instinctive, muscle memory reaction to being observed. "Harrison Sterling," Miller said, his voice low, not wanting to disturb the breakfast crowd. "I have a warrant for your arrest." Harrison nodded. A strange wave of relief washed over him. At least in federal custody, he would have a bed. "Is it the Ponzi scheme?" Harrison asked, his voice rasping from disuse. "Securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering," Miller recited. "Stand up, please." They cuffed him. The metal was cold against his wrists, tighter than the Rolex that used to sit there. As they led him out, Marge, the waitress, watched from behind the counter. She didn't look surprised. In this city, everyone fell eventually. The interrogation room at the Federal Plaza was painted a color that could only be described as institutional despair. Harrison sat at the metal table, a public defender named Mr. Katz sitting nervously beside him. Katz looked like he had graduated law school the previous Tuesday. "Mr. Sterling," Agent Miller said, entering the room with a thick file. He sat down and placed a coffee on the table. He didn't offer one to Harrison. "My client invokes his right to silence," Katz squeaked. "Relax, counselor," Miller said, opening the file. "We're not looking for a confession. We already have everything. The ledgers, the emails, the encryption keys to the accounts in the Caymans." Harrison frowned. "That's impossible. Those keys are on a server in—" "They were delivered to us yesterday," Miller interrupted, "by a very cooperative witness in Zurich." Harrison froze. "Victoria. She sold me out," Harrison whispered, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "She took the plane, she took the money, and then she handed me to the wolves to save her own skin. I knew it. She's vicious." Miller looked at Harrison with an expression that was halfway between pity and disgust. He slid a piece of paper across the table. "Read this." Harrison looked down. It was a plea agreement. "The defendant, Harrison Sterling. The charge, 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The sentence recommendation, 60 months, 5 years, in a minimum security federal facility. Restitution, $312,000, already remitted in full by trustee." Harrison stared at the numbers. 5 years? My lawyers told me I was looking at 25 to life." "You were," Miller said, "but your wife made a deal. She returned every dime of the stolen investor money. She liquidated the shell companies. She even handed over the jet this morning at JFK. She traded her immunity and her potential cut of the fortune for your leniency." Harrison looked up, his eyes wide. "She gave the money back. All of it?" "She didn't keep a cent," Miller confirmed. "She walked away with nothing but her personal savings and her freedom. She did that so you wouldn't die in prison, Harrison. She figured 5 years was enough time for you to learn how to be a human being again." Harrison slumped back in his chair. The air left his lungs. He had spent 20 years thinking Victoria was a simple accessory to his life, a woman who enjoyed the view from the passenger seat. He had measured her worth in diamonds and dinner parties. He realized now that she was the only reason he had survived this long. She had been the load-bearing wall of his existence, and he had taken a sledgehammer to her. "Where is she?" Harrison asked, his voice cracking. "Gone," Miller said, closing the file. "And if you're smart, you'll never look for her. Sign the paper, Harrison. It's the last gift you'll ever get." Harrison picked up the cheap government pen. His hand shook. He signed his name. 5 years later. The cafe in London was small, tucked away on a side street in Kensington. It smelled of rain and roasted beans. Victoria sat at a corner table, reading a paperback novel. Her hair was cut shorter now, a chic bob that framed her face. She wore a thick wool sweater and jeans. No diamonds, no designer labels, just comfort. Across from her sat Leo. He was 25 now, working as an architect. He looked like his father, but he had his mother's eyes, kind and sharp. "I got a letter from him," Leo said, pushing an envelope across the table. Victoria looked at it. The return address was a halfway house in Yonkers, New York. "Did you read it?" she asked. "Yeah," Leo said. "He's working at a hardware store. Says he enjoys it. Says it's honest work. He asked about you." Victoria didn't touch the envelope. She took a sip of her tea. "What did you tell him?" "I didn't reply yet," Leo said. "I wanted to ask you first." Victoria looked out the window. People were rushing by, chasing buses, chasing meetings, chasing money. She remembered the hum of the Gulf Stream, the taste of the vintage champagne, the thrill of the altitude. It felt like a dream someone else had lived. She looked back at her son. She had peace. She had her integrity. And she had the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had closed the books properly. "Tell him I'm happy," Victoria said softly. "And tell him I hope he finally found a way to be rich without the money." Leo smiled and put the letter back in his pocket. "I think he's trying, Mom." "Good," she said. "That's all we can ask for." She signaled the waiter for the check. When it came, she didn't wait for a man to pay it. She didn't charge it to a black card. She pulled out a worn leather wallet, counted out the pounds, and left a generous tip. She walked out into the London drizzle, pulling her coat tight. She didn't have a limousine waiting. She walked to the tube station, descended into the earth, and disappeared into the crowd. Just another face in the city, invisible, ordinary, and completely, wonderfully free. And that is the story of Harrison and Victoria Sterling. It's a powerful reminder that in the game of life, the loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest. Harrison measured his worth in assets, titles, and leverage, never realizing that his greatest asset was the loyalty of the woman he betrayed. Victoria showed us that true power isn't about what you can hoard. It's about what you can walk away from. She didn't just win the divorce, she won her soul back. Harrison lost his fortune, but thanks to the grace of the wife he underestimated, he gained a second chance to find his humanity. Sometimes, hitting rock bottom is the only way to find out who you really are. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, justice, and redemption, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. What would you have done if you were Victoria? Would you have saved Harrison from a life sentence, or would you have let him rot? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want more deep dive stories like this, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.